So before I start this section, I have a huge debt of gratitude to Alicia Evans and Shayna Moore. They're junior developers at Software Services by Scientist.com. They used to be called Notch 8. They're one of our service provider partners. So Alicia and Shayna wrote a Samvera Tech 101 article. I've included that in the resources list. And their analogies and some of the ways that they describe how Samvera works, I'm using directly in this presentation. And I talked to Shayna about that when I was designing this workshop. So huge debt of gratitude to those two. I want to start kind of at that very highest level, talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we say open source. In case you're not familiar. So open source, at the very most basic definition, it's a type of software license. So it's a license that you put on software that's created that says this is freely available to use, modify, and enhance. In theory, anyone could take Samvera's current code base for a given project, go off with it, change it up a bunch, and then sell it as proprietary software. It's something you can do under an open source license. It's common that that happens sort of on the sort of business side of open source. But in the cultural heritage ecosystem, open source projects provide often the digital infrastructure that we need to do our work. So it's software that lots of places need. They want it to be built in the open so that it's transparent. You know what went into it, you know what's being worked on, you sort of know what the next steps are, and then it's used and supported by those who rely on it. So they're giving input. That can seem like kind of a library land idea or kind of a commons idea, but actually much of the entire internet and all the software we use relies on open source software. So Google has an entire huge department of people, and all they do is promote and help maintain the open source software that they rely on at different levels in their technology. Proprietary software vendors, they all have open source components inside of their stack. You might not know about it because it's not as transparent. They don't share their code, but they're certain to have some open source components within. So super common in the software world. And then the projects that fall under the Samvera umbrella that we'll dive into, they all have what's called an Apache 2 license, the type of open source license. And it's all created in the open and anyone can contribute to the code. So I'm going to stop there. Just make sure nobody has any questions about open source. All right. So let's talk about the stack. So you'll hear the phrase stack. A stack is all of the pieces of software that make up something as complex as a digital repository. There's lots of different components, lots of different layers. Samvera is not a single software product or project. It's a big collection of components. And all of those components are built and supported in the Samvera community. And then in addition, Samvera repositories draw on many, many other open source components, and those are maintained by other open source communities. So as we talk through the Samvera software, you'll see how interdependent all of it is. And that's, as I said, common in all software, but especially in open source. I see a question here, how is security addressed? That's a great question. Security is something I can't talk about in great detail, but in the Samvera community, individual developers or institutions who find a problem can make a special security report. And then the community leaders who are in charge of that project will address it and then put out a patch at the most basic. It's a complex question. There's also, I'll talk about GitHub, which is where all of the work is done. GitHub has, and the testing suite that we use within GitHub has a lot of automated tests, and those they're similar to sort of how you have antivirus on your computer. They will check for known issues in the software. So that's another way. Is there yes, yeah. Dedicated to testing, absolutely. And I'll get into testing in a little bit. So talking about the stack, I want to stop for a moment and talk about Ruby and Ruby on Rails. So most of these components in the Samvera community are written, not all by any stretch, but a majority are written in the Ruby programming language using the Ruby on Rails framework. So what is a framework? So a framework is a collection of code and tools and utilities that adhere to a specific structure when writing software. So frameworks are a way to help make code more organized, and it allows developers to be more productive, so they're not reinventing the wheel. And the way that Shana and Alicia talked about a framework is that it's like a stencil. So imagine that we were given the task to cut out 1,000 pumpkin-shaped holiday cards. So we could all just draw 1,000 pumpkins and cut every single one of them, or we could use a pumpkin-shaped stencil or a punch tool, and maybe then we could even stack the paper and do more than one at once. And from there, we can color those, we can customize them, but fundamentally, we want to make the same shape for each of them. And so the stencil helps us do that. So that's what the framework does for us. So the frameworks in Ruby on Rails, what they say is they emphasize convention over configuration. So it's just a way to make things more efficient, and it makes it a lot easier to collaborate. And of course, the easier it is to collaborate in open source, the more efficient developers can be, because the foundation of all of the applications and the way you expect them to work is going to be the same. All those pumpkins are pumpkin shaped. Whatever you put on top of them is up to you, but they're all shaped like pumpkins. And we don't have to use the pumpkin stamp forever. There might be better stencils later, and then we would move to a different framework, but we would still always be using that stencil. So I'll stop there, see if there's any questions about Ruby. And I also take a drink. Okay, so we're back to our stack of components. So at the foundation of the stack in Samvera is this base pile of components. It's called the data store layer. So a data store is a repository for continuously storing and managing collections of data. So you could think of it as a physical library, but it's for digital objects in our context. So I'm going to touch on 3 elements that make the base of the data store in Samvera digital repositories. So first, Fedora. So we can think of Fedora as the bookshelves in a library. It's the persistence layer is what it's called, and it's where the actual content and content metadata is stored. So we value Fedora for the preservation that it provides of that content and metadata. Fedora isn't a requirement in the Samvera stack, but it is a really popular option. And let's see. Yes, so one way to think about it is if you're migrating content, everything that's going to move from the repository your content's in now to the new repository, the stuff that actually moves over, that's what lives in the persistence layer. And everything else in the software stack is about creating the way you access that content, search it, view it, create it, all of that. But the actual content itself lives the persistence layer, and that's what migrates over. So Fedora is also an open source software community. We work with them pretty closely. They're also a library and cultural heritage open source community, so they need membership support and they need development support to keep working. And another part of this data store layer is Solr. So Solr is what's called an index-based data store. And basically, this is where the power of search functionality comes up in Samvera applications. Solr is really quick. It allows for indexing records by an ID number as well as by other metadata. So you can index by author. And that just means that a record can be linked to and referenced in multiple ways to make search faster and easier. So Solr answers the question, what items, when you query Solr, it can say, what items have metadata that matches this query? And then it can return it. Solr is what's called an Apache program. It is used all over the world by all different kinds of for-profit, nonprofit software. It's very popular. It has its own open source community, but that's highly supported by for-profit companies. So they have a lot of people who work to make Solr work because a lot of people rely on it. But it's also a piece of our repository stack. And then Valkyrie, this is the first piece of software, the first component that is part of the Samvera community. So it lives with us, it's maintained by Samvera, and it's what's called a data mapper. It's a gem. We'll talk about that. In Ruby, these components that you write are called gems, which is cute. So you think Ruby gem. So it's a Ruby gem, and it enables multiple backends for the storage of the content and metadata in Samvera. So Valkyrie can be used to talk to different versions of Fedora, but it can also be used to talk to other places where you might choose to store your content and metadata. So it just gives us more options for that kind of storage because different kinds of repositories based on their size or their type of content or the way that their infrastructure is set up might want different persistence layers for their content. So if you will hear a lot of talk at Connect next week and have in the community about Valkyrized hierarchs or Valkyrization in hierarchs. And that is about phasing out an old data mapper that we've always used in hierarchs and replacing it with Valkyrie, which makes things simpler and also gives people more options. So that's Valkyrie. So I'll pause there after going through those layers and see if anybody has any questions about that base layer of the stack. Okay. So there are other parts of Samvera, some of which are optional, some of which are not, that use other open source software. So there's just 3 listed here that contribute to different elements of the user interface for Samvera Technologies. So during Connect, you'll see in here presentations that reference Blacklight or Spotlight or IIIF, the IIIF viewer. And these are all other open source communities that have some overlap with our community as well, that create components that do very specific things that lots of different types of repositories need. How, what data are fed into Solr? I think that Solr is used for search, Tao, so it's anything that's in the persistence layer. I'm pretty sure that Solr queries that persistence layer. It's sort of the component that allows us to be able to search for something that matches a query. And then there's different, like Blacklight is used to actually display those search results, but Solar does the actual querying of the persistence layer. Yes, it searches the metadata, but also can search full text if that's in there. Thank you. All right, next part of our stack is what we call the core components. So the core components are Ruby gems, and they provide interfaces for interacting with Fedora and Solar and other commonly needed features within a digital repository. So if you use a digital repository where you want to create derivatives, copies of your content, there is a core component that does that derivative generation, just as an example. We have a lot of core components, and they can also be used by institutions who are creating just about everything from scratch. If they have a big development support, a lot of developers on staff, they want to create a completely custom front end. They might still want to use core components, and many of them still use some of these core components because they need some of those common repository processes, and they don't want to have to write those from scratch. So they might just be using a few blocks, but it still saves them a lot of time. And then they know that the community is also helping to support those critical functions that we all need in our repositories. Okay, so now on top of core components, we're getting into the three options in the Samvera community that are often called a solution bundle. And a solution bundle is a bundle of components that are sort of kept together, given a name, that deliver functionality for a specific set of use cases. So Hyrax is the one you'll hear about the most in the Samvera community. It's a fully featured repository front end. It has self-deposit, and it has administrative workflow features. It's well suited for electronic theses and dissertations, and it can also be customized for digital collections and to fit local workflows. If you maybe in the past have heard of repositories called Sophia or called curation concerns, Hyrax is sort of a descendant of those two systems. And one benefit of starting with Hyrax as your solution bundle, instead of just using only a handful of core components and building it all from scratch, is that there's a lot of features that are especially useful for repository owners, and that you have a whole community of people who rely on and are going to maintain. So for instance, Hyrax has a dashboard, a user-friendly dashboard, and it has a component that creates administrator accounts. So if you don't want to have to write those from scratch, you can get those from Hyrax. It gives you the ability to configure workflows, generate work types, upload multiple files and folders, and to set user control. Those sorts of things are all part of Hyrax. So a different solution bundle for a different use case is Avalon Media System. Avalon is a platform for managing and providing access to large collections of digital audio and video. It's built on top of the core components. Avalon is actually older than any other Samvera software. It was sort of the first thing that joined in. And Avalon has a goal right now in the next year or so to become Hyrax based. So the stack would look different. You'd have Hyrax on top of the core components and then Avalon. So it would sit on top. That would mean that Avalon's functionality could be well integrated into existing Hyrax repositories, and it would also bring some advantages to Avalon, and it would make things more efficient for both of those software bundles, because they could share more of those components that they both use. So that work is going to start as soon as Valkyrie is fully integrated into Hyrax. That's sort of a prerequisite for Avalon to be able to work with Hyrax. So that's another thing that you'll hear about, is Avalon moving to sit on top of Hyrax or be integrated with Hyrax. They'll still be separate things. You can still use those different functionality for different use cases. It just means that the development will be more efficient. And that efficiency already exists in our other solution bundle, which is Haiku. Haiku does sit on top of Hyrax. So if you have a Haiku repository, you technically also have Hyrax. Haiku, the use case for Haiku is what's called multi-tenancy. So it comes with all the features of Hyrax, but because it's multi-tenant, that means that one repository owner can create a whole bunch of different repository instances and manage them. So for example, this is really of interest to consortia who want to be able to administer a bunch of individual repositories for their members and have those repositories be branded for the member and have the library's logo and only that library's content, but the consortia can do all of the development work and keep it up to date and host it and all of those things for the member. So there's also some other APIs and bulk import scripts and other things. And there's greater customization compared to Hyrax, because when you're creating a whole bunch of different individual repositories, you want to be able to make them all look completely different if that's what you need. And there's a lot on the back end of Haiku that makes that multi-tenancy happen, that makes it easy to maintain and deploy when you have a whole bunch of individual repositories. So Haiku as a service, that's something that the vendors in our community provide. It makes it a lot easier for them to say, hey, here, do you want this repository? We'll spin it up for you right away, customize it for you. But it's a lot easier on their end to manage it through Haiku than to build individual Hyrax instances. So that's the big difference between Hyrax and Haiku. And I see you have a question. Can the individual repository have different metadata fields? I believe so, Anna Marie. If they don't right now, it's one of the things that's on their roadmap, because that's been something that's been really important, especially if, for example, you want to be able to, like a consortia wants to be able to host for a member an institutional repository, and then also maybe a digital collection for a different member. They are going to need different metadata fields. So if it's not there yet, I know that it's on the roadmap. So you can think of customization in this stack as repainting the blocks, cutting notches in the blocks. Sometimes you want to carve an entire new block from scratch because you don't have any other block that's shaped like that. Maybe you want one that has a magnet in it. You could make all of those, but you would want to keep the basic blocks you need because you don't want to have to carve everything from scratch. So lots and lots of people who use Hyrax or Avalon in particular, and even Haiku, they're going to have other open source software that they might integrate to help with their specific use case. They might have a custom app that a vendor could build for them, or that developers on their staff could build. And those components can get swapped out, they can be changed. So it's a lot of that flexibility that we talk about in Samvera is because of the way that this stack is built and the way that you can sort of take things in and out depending on what you need. So I will stop here and